Welcome to Automation's official design competition. In this video you are joining us for the roundtable discussion of the finalist designs in Category A, the 1946 to 1960 People's Car. Your hosts Chris and Rob are joined by today's very special guest and judge, Automotiveflux. Andrew is a long-time Automation and BeamNG content creator with a fancy for exploring the extremes of what is possible with the two games. Check out his work with the links in the description below. We'll start by asking our guest judge a few questions first, and then we'll dive into a more in-depth analysis of each finalist in an open roundtable format.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Andrew.
So, my name is Andrew. In real life, I work in the civil engineering field. I'm not an engineer, but I'm a technologist, which is sort of a little bit less than an engineer in education. And so that is, I guess the best way that I could define myself as being somebody who thinks in that sort of way. Very logical, very interested in mechanics and things.
Now tell us a little bit about your online presence. So what do you do and where do you post and what will people see?
So I post mostly on YouTube and mostly Automation/BeamNG content. The stuff that I make is generally fairly unique with some quotations. I think last week I made a monkey ball as an example. It's not exactly the hardcore design stuff that you might be seeing today.
So tell us about some exciting and interesting projects you're working on and what you have planned for your online presence in the future.
So in terms of my YouTube, it's weird to say, but I don't really think super long term. Like, generally speaking, we have these showcases that I do where I'm taking user or like viewer submissions for cars and then making them into a stream or something. So I'll do a couple of those next year, ideally, but it's really week to week on my channel as I come up with more ideas and whatever seems to be relevant that particular week. I do have a second channel called Bright Hill where I do project car stuff. And in that I've been making my own go-kart from scrap metal, basically, just kind of welding it together. So that's an ongoing project with infrequent updates. But other than that, it's really just whatever happens to be interesting to me at the time.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. We'll put links to all of Andrew's social media presence into the description below. So I guess the next question is, how did you get interested in cars in the first place?
So I actually had to think about this question because that was ages ago. I feel pretty old at nearly 27. I don't know. I've always been interested in cars. It sort of stems from just being very hands-on with things. I had a lot of Hot Wheels as a kid. I had a lot of Lego as well and Meccano. And so I've always just had an interest in things that are mechanical, and therefore I think cars sort of became that outlet. But more than just cars as well, I've also been interested in boats, RC cars as an example, bikes, pretty much anything that has any mechanical working parts is of interest to me. So yeah, I think it just sort of became my main interest is cars, and then steamrolled from there with like various gifts of books on cars and various Hot Wheels, and then more sets to build, and then eventually RC cars, and then I turned 18 and I bought my first car, and it just steamrolled from there.
Yeah, that's a pretty common theme, actually. A lot of our judges and viewers, and actually by extension, a lot of our community gets interested in a very young age, whether it's in the design or the engineering side of cars. And they find automation and sort of the related content to be a really great outlet and a way that they can really explore that in sort of their own terms. So you mentioned that you bought your first car when you were 18. So tell us a little bit about your car history, both sort of the highlights and the lowlights. And I should say that nothing is too boring here.
So I'll run through every car that I've had. There aren't that many. I think it's 5 total. But my first car came out of necessity. I was doing a co-op with my college, and I had to drive down to the city, in this case downtown Toronto, to to this job that I was working at, and I was driving my mom's van every day. So she was like, "Fine, you can buy your own car," reluctantly, and that's how I ended up getting this. So my first car was a 2003 Subaru Impreza Outback Sport, which is a hatchback. So if you're unfamiliar with that, it's basically an Impreza, but two-tone, because back in the day, Outback was a trim level for the Legacy and for the Impreza. It wasn't its own car like it is these days. So my car was this two-tone gold and black Impreza, and I really, really liked that car. But 3 years later, I think, it eventually returned to dust, as all things do here in Ontario. And it was getting a little bit worse for wear. More than that, I took it to a shop and they quoted me way too much to fix it, and I decided that was it. So I ended up buying an 03 Infiniti G35 as a replacement, and that sort of kicked off my love for Infinitis, for better or worse. After that, I bought an Infiniti G35 Coupe because the sedan wasn't enough. So I had those two at the same time. And then the whole saga on my second channel of me parting out that coupe and selling its pieces for scrap, basically, because it was rusty, as all things are in Ontario. And as a replacement for that coupe, I bought a Hyundai Tiburon, my first manual car, and my first coupe that actually works as well. So I still have that car. My sedan Infiniti has been sold. And then as a more reasonable and also practical vehicle, I have a 2019 Ram 1500 that I use to basically facilitate my projects, i.e. the go-kart stuff and the Tiburon eventually as well. So yeah, that's my car history in a nutshell.
Well, it's certainly very extensive and actually a surprisingly diverse car history as well, too. You don't really seem to be, beholden to one brand necessarily or one style of car. It's also sort of your hobbies and necessities kind of have driven that a little bit as well, obviously.
There was a while there where I never bought a car newer than 2004 because I don't know what it is. I was just stuck to early 2000s Japanese cars. So that was the Subaru and then the two Infinitis. But then branching out a little bit, my Tiburon is an 07, so a little bit newer. And then finally I gave in and bought something modern. But there was a streak of old Japanese cars there for a while that I don't think has fully ended. If there's any thread of consistency in my car line, it's there.
So I'm guessing that's kind of the cars and era of cars that you're most interested in is the sort of 2000s Japanese cars and sort of surrounding. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question as well. It tends to be like late 90s, early 2000s Japanese cars that are most interesting to me. That might just be just because of the age that I am and growing up with those cars as being really cool cars. Like back when I was a kid, I had a paper route, and a guy on my street had an Infiniti G35 Coupe. One of the nice ones with like Brembo brakes and all that. And I used to walk by it on my paper route, just looking at it every single week when I went past there. And it's no surprise that I ended up owning two of them in the future. So that's, I think that's just how that stuff is born.
So if you were to maybe put any one of those cars in that era and from Japan into your garage, which one do you think you would want the most?
That's hard because it changes based on the wind. I don't know. I have specific cars that I like. I really like Evos as well as STIs. Realistically speaking, I'd love to get maybe like an Evo 8 or 9, which would be great. If I was going to import something from Japan, it'd probably be a R33 GTR. That's the dream, I guess.
That's fantastic. And those are all really interesting and actually quite exciting cars as well. I mean, I'm not the biggest Japanese car fan in the world, but I certainly have an incredible amount of respect for those choices for sure. So talking about automotive design, that's the tie-in with that is what kind of drew you into the Infinitis? What specifically about those was really what caught your eye and got your interest going in those?
This is a tough question because sometimes it's hard to put into words how, like, for the reasons that you actually like a car. Like, for me, I might have to sit down and just look at it and just start like listing things I like about it. But I really feel that cars are more of the sum of their parts. Like I can like specific design elements. Like for example, I really like the big wings that you see on STIs, although I know some people don't necessarily like those. That's for me something that I find cool. But an STI isn't cool just because it has a big wing. It's the whole package. So in terms of just purely aesthetic design, it's difficult.
Oh, for sure. And that's actually a very considered answer now that I think about it, that it's, you have to take the car kind of as a whole. I mean, there are definitely parts about it that you can like or dislike, but
Yeah, exactly. Like with my Tibron as an example, I really like the way the rear end of the car looks. But then when you spin around to the front, it's a little bit iffy. It's like, but I still like the car overall. I just would like it more if the front matched the back a bit better. It just has to be like this cohesive design. And I think the cars that are always the best in design are those ones that are very cohesive and just very true to their nature.
fantastic. That actually answered my next question, is what do you feel makes for a good car design? So I guess we'll go to the flip side of that and say, or ask, what do you think makes for a bad car design?
Well, I have another more ambiguous answer. I think some people can label stuff like cars being well over-designed or under-designed maybe as being a problem. Like some people point at I think last generation Civic Type R as being a car that's way over-designed. It's got wings and grills everywhere, as an example. But again, it really does come down to the full package. If a car has just this like magnificent front end, just beautiful, very handsomely crafted, and then you turn it to the side and you look at that angle and it's just, wow, this is the worst looking car I've ever seen in my life, then it's it's all about that sum of the parts that sometimes if things don't match, it just doesn't make sense to your eyes, and I think that leads to a bad design.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. I guess we'll have one more question here, and I think I might already know the answer to this, but it is, if you could work for any car company as a designer, you just snap your fingers and find yourself working for them tomorrow, which one do you think you'd be most interested in working for?
This is a really hard question too, because I don't feel that I have any design shops enough to be working in the art department of any of these manufacturers, but I think it'd probably be Nissan, just because I feel like I like their most recent car designs more than some of the other standard cars these days. Infinity's kind of going downhill at the moment, but their cars haven't changed in years either. I think Nissan is a safe place to see progress in bringing some of those design qualities from Infinity over. Stuff like the new 400Z. I think that's a pretty handsome looking car.
Okay, so those are all some very interesting answers from you, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me here. It's good to be part of this.
Absolutely, and we're glad you agreed to be part of it. So, I guess we're gonna dive into looking at some cars then. You guys ready?
Ready or not, here we come.
Right on.
So the first thing that I noticed about finalist number 1 was the suicide doors, which I thought was a very interesting touch. And I also noticed that the rims specifically seem to be quite large. A little bit of a mismatch for the car overall, but it is a very nice design. I really like the color, and I like the two-tone aspects as well.
This certainly seems to be a little bit of a combination of, well, first of all, I should say probably a little Eastern European almost in its look. Beautiful set of colors on this one, and it is almost a little off-roady small family vehicle. And I really liked how consistent it is, switching between pure front and pure back view, as you basically just switch the placement of the large lights and you have the same look again. And that was quite expertly made. One weird thing I noticed with this one is that the front grille shape sits in a nicely rounded well, but is itself a trapezoid, is called in English, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That was actually the first thing I was going to bring up, is that there are some inconsistent shapes in this design, specifically the front grille. And again, if you go towards the back, the indent where the license plate is also a little bit inconsistent with sort of the shapes that are going on in the back. I will agree 100% that the color choice on this car is absolutely spot on. I really very much like that. It's very period appropriate that it would be sort of that light sky blue and kind of a cream on the roof. Although I might say that would be, depending on specifically what era within the design brief and where in the world this car was made, that might be a kind of a very premium option actually. But it doesn't suffer from it regardless. And I think again, pointing, another thing that Rob mentioned is that this car has a very high ride height. And while I understand that in a lot of places it would be kind of a necessity to have a really high ride height because of poor quality roads, I think this may take it just a little bit too far.
I noticed that as well as a bit of a common theme between a lot of the vehicles that we're going to see in this finalist category. A lot of them seem to be more premium versions of the people's car, as it were. Lots of chrome and lots of extra features, and maybe some things you wouldn't find in the most basic of models.
Yeah, agreed. There are definitely some more premium looking cars for sure. And this is certainly one of them.
I really like how, at the same time as it is obviously a little bit more premium, it is still very modest in how the fixtures are laid out. It isn't boastful in any way, apart from maybe the paint, which is really beautiful though. And lots of hinges, like the detail is there where it is being used. But overall there's not much on it that would shout at you in terms of, hey, look at me, I'm super detailed, I'm a premium version.
Oh, I agree 100%. One of the really neat things, especially from the rear view, that a lot of people may not pick up on, but it's very period appropriate and really kind of brings the car into the context of its design era, is I really like the single reverse light and the single rear red fog light sort of side by side right on top of the bumper. That's exactly the sort of thing that they would do in the time, just to save a little bit of money in the production of the car. Instead of having two reverse lights and two fog lights, you've got one of each.
This might be a general overall observation, but if you notice the red sway bar at the bottom, it seems like a lot of people, with the suspension as well, they didn't change the color of that. It seems to be just the basic stuff that Automation gives when you first start up a model.
Yeah, that may be a little bit of a miscue in that regard, and it makes it feel like it's got some aftermarket performance parts on it.
This is the race spec.
Yeah, exactly.
So this car is a bit of a mini-esque vehicle, which is cool and definitely fits the period. One thing I noticed, it's very burdened. It's got a lot of luggage on the top and on the trunk end, and the car is sagging because of it. Very nice attention to detail on that.
Overall, I find this to be extremely consistent in its design, apart from maybe the taillights. But also looking great there. If you go to the front, you can see that the subtle lines across the bonnet there, which have a very appropriate angle to them. It doesn't make the car look static. It flows really nicely with the grille shape that is put on there, which, by the way, is quite impressive in size. And in general, there's a lot going on the front. It's nicely crafted though. But you will find those kind of sun rays come back on the rear of the car, and also have, of course, then appropriate flow that is a little bit more straight. Rear engine car, and it certainly seems to be extremely appropriate wherever you look, including the luggage on the roof, which back then was still allowed. And I think from the front 3/4, you see how it is. Oh no, it was the straight front. You see how it is attached properly as well. That's a really nice touch.
Yeah, there's a lot of really great details in this design, from the luggage on top and stuffed in behind the rear seats to just how the interior kind of peeks out through the glass is really quite nice. One thing I will say is a little bit of a miss perhaps is, even though this car is rear-engined, it certainly has a very large front grille and a very maybe overly blingy front grille, certainly for, unless this is again, you know, one of a more premium option. I think it might be more appropriate if it was toned down a little bit and perhaps made a little bit smaller, because I also kind of imagine this car was not exactly a powerhouse in the day, so I don't think it would need quite as much cooling as the grille implies it would. I generally quite like the color. That's sort of an egg yellow is a really period appropriate color, and you know, as Andrew pointed out, I think we should just have a quick moment of thought for the poor overworked rear suspension of this little car. It is being asked to do an awful lot.
Yeah, I really just load up the family of 4 on those brown lined seats there. It's going to be even more overburdened than it is, but I think that's a nice little touch, and it really just adds to the overall aesthetic of it as being a practical family vehicle for road trips, I guess, all over Europe.
Certainly seems like a European car. Well, one thing I would like to point out is the excellent framing on the side profile. With the luggage holding lines right on top, the little bars that go across the roof, and the subtle chrome line on the bottom. Those are subtle, but they do frame the car very nicely, and that means that not much else detail is required on the side to really make the design work.
And also that I'd like to point out that the builder has put a very subtle drip rail along sort of the roof and along the A pillar, flowing down the C pillar. That just, again, really sort of frames the upper part of the car, which is very nicely done. Overall, it's a very nice design. I quite like how the theme that's going on here and how the builder has approached it.
I would go as far and say it is the quintessential small family car of the era.
I was going to say, I just think this action shot really proves that practicality. She's moving.
And it's certainly not because of acceleration that the rear is squatting.
Definitely not. So this is a very interesting car, just because it seems to be the only one that appears to be built for speed. It's low, and it's got a big vent on the back there, once again indicating rear engine. Very small, and definitely looks quick for what it is.
I think, though, that this car completely misses the brief, and I have scored it as such. And this is because this looks like a concept car that was made in the 40s sometime, of like, how do you envision the speediness of the future? Or alternatively, it is a how do you envision an alternate history kind of racy little fun car if the technology, or if the economy rather, would have been a little different and people would be into those little small racing things. I think it looks extremely futuristic for to be in that era, and I like the look. It's cute, and as Andrew points out, it's also looking sporty. But I can't really get into it as seeing it as a proper competitor in this segment that we're looking at.
I think I might have to disagree with that a little bit. This is exactly the kind of car that you would have seen manufacturers getting into sort of towards the end of the brief, like maybe the mid 1950s to 1960 period, when, you know, the economies and certainly in post World War II Europe were really roaring back to life and people had money. Well, what was one of the first things they wanted to do with their cars was go racing, and people still weren't particularly wealthy, so all of a sudden you had a lot of really high performance little cars that came out. Like, you had hotted up versions of the Fiat 500, and Volkswagen was starting to dabble with the idea of putting bigger engines into the Beetle, and a few other cars came along with sort of similar ideas. So I could see this being appropriate, like right at the end of the design brief. But beyond that, I'm not really convinced of the design in general. I think it's not particularly harmonious from front to back. There are some miscues here and there, and I'm really not sure about the color. I don't think this is the kind of color, even though they were into really sort of offbeat colors in the time period. I don't think they'd be this offbeat necessarily.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, specifically when it comes to the color. It's a very interesting pale pink kind of aesthetic to it, and the interior also kind of brings that in. You can see the gauge there in the center is also pink, with sort of a dark brown too. One thing I do like about it is the decals on the side. I think that's very cool. But again, I agree with Rob. This looks like a concept car. It's like a hot version of the people's car, but definitely not the same kind of practicality that we've seen in some other vehicles. It's definitely a race-specific or just concept-only type of vehicle.
One thing I wondered, could you go to the front three-quarter view? Do we actually have... Oh yes, we do have a kind of +3 seats there as a little bench that barely fits some children. And do you get a little bit of a mouse look from the front with a little nose logo and the E?
And the whiskers? Yeah, I kind of do see a little bit of a mousy look to it. A frightened mouse at that with the big headlights.
Oh yes.
Just needs a tail.
Yeah. It definitely has kind of a presence on the road, though, that's for sure, with it being so low and sort of an odd combination of being really tall and bulbous and hugging the road. It's interesting, to say the least.
So this car has the distinction of being the first convertible that we're looking at today, which is cool. It's nice to see some stuff that is a little bit more unique in that aspect. One thing that I noticed about it is that the headlights appear to be slightly tinged yellow. I'm not sure if that is a period correct addition, but it is an interesting touch. Almost brings in some rally vibes.
One thing that just astounds me with this one is the absolutely incredible amount of detail that has been put into it. And it is detail that is sometimes on the border of making it a little too busy, but it is so well crafted all around that I can't really fault it for that either. Of course, we do get a lot of detail from the greenhouse that is all opened up and makes its beautiful views accessible to us. But just look at this rear. It is such a classic, nice looking design, and those little round vents there, a little early maybe for the period, but little jet fighter vibe I'm getting. And it is, especially when you look from the three-quarter front view there, it seems like a bit of an odd element. But at the same time, the shape is familiar from all kinds of other places around there, so I can't really fault it for trying it in this way. Lots of chrome, even though it's subtle, and this one has a really solid approach to grille on the front. It's just reduced the grille down to some lines of chrome, and it's very appropriate, and also has a little bit of a bulge there to fit in some extra luggage, and has actually a way of opening that hood as well. So lots of good stuff I see here.
Yeah, I really like this design. You know, that the front it's almost bordering on busy, but it just stays on the side of being appropriate, and all the details in it are very nicely considered. And it's very obvious right from the get-go that this is a rear-engine car, just from how the front grille is treated, and it really conveys properly what I think you'd see from a rear-engine car of the period, where there really isn't a grille opening necessarily in the front of the car. The headlights are a nice touch too. Just to touch on what Andrew mentioned, the slight yellow tinge is absolutely a period appropriate thing that you'd see in certainly a lot of European countries where they mandated sort of yellow headlights or driving lights at the time, just because they thought it was better and helped reduce glare for drivers on the road, especially when it was dark and wet, for sure. The rear of this it's absolutely about as perfect as you could hope a car like this would be, from the hinges to the stamped out cooling fins in the rear the rear engine cover. The taillights are maybe about the weakest feature in the rear, but that's really being very nitpicky. Overall, it's a fantastic design, I think. There are a couple misses. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I think the way that the doors open is maybe a little bit weird with
didn't even.
And the normal opening rear door. I kind of feel a little bit sorry for that poor B pillar having to support those doors, especially if they're both open. That's a lot of weight.
Yeah, strange that you mentioned that, because I commented on the doors being that way in our first car, but seeing them here now, it opens so weirdly because your doors would smash together if you open them at the same time. Can't believe I didn't notice that at the beginning.
Maybe they have some incredible future technology that is separating them a little while opening them. But yes, the poor B-pillar wouldn't be fancying that anyway, especially not if there's a bit of a breeze and pulling the whole car apart, basically. One thing that I noticed, which just instantly spun a story in my head, is fuel tank in the front and engine in the rear, so you will always have that beautiful smell of gasoline in the compartment, because these things always were leaky, weren't they?
Oh yeah, I noted that as well in my comments. So you've got fuel lines running underneath you as you sit in the passenger seat, which is kind of fun. One thing that is commendable is that if for some reason some bodies you try and cut a big chunk out of them, like the roof, and it just does not come out nicely, but this one looks very cleanly done, especially considering the circumstances. I think overall this car is just very clean, minus the weird doors and maybe the slightly odd taillights. It's just a very well thought out design, and yeah, and the interior as well. Important for a convertible to have some details there, because obviously the roof is not hiding things, so it's got a full set of gauges in the front there and buttons and stuff, and that's really cool too.
Another just general observation is that when I look at this car, I just find so much to look at and enjoy that it seems like the perfect amount of detail for a car, and it's so close to being too busy, as I previously stated, but it keeps it interesting and has some unique design approaches. One question though to Chris, what do you think about that chromy, large area chromy part on the rear, around the rear tires?
Well, I think it's very appropriate, actually. The idea is that would be essentially keeping you from chipping your paint on the rear fender flare from stones and whatnot kicked up from the front tires. It's definitely something you would see on cars of this era, especially considering the roads were maybe not necessarily great and there'd be a lot of gravel roads you'd be driving on. Whether or not it would actually be chrome in this case on a relatively inexpensive car, or maybe perhaps another material like just plated steel, I'm not 100% sure on, but I think my overall thought is it is an appropriate piece, but is it actually implemented appropriately in this design? I'm not 100% sure on that.
All right. I do like it design-wise. It adds quite a bit of weight to that section of the car as it pulls the eyes, and that is an otherwise rather empty section, so it's what it accomplishes is that the car overall feels more balanced because of it. And yeah, overall, great. I love it.
So this one has the distinction of being what I assume to be one of the few front engine cars in our class today, which is interesting. One thing that I find to be very funny with this one is if you go a little bit further in the pictures, I think maybe the action shot represents this the best. But the wheels are very, very sunk into the body. So much so that you could put a second set there as well and it'd just be dualies on all four corners, still not sticking out of the fenders. I find that to be a very interesting little detail.
This car seems to be, if you go back to the profile view of it, seems to be a really grounded design. In that there's nothing really on it that super surprises me. Seems to be reasonably well done. And if you switch to the front three-quarter there, it isn't awfully consistent with the massive grille at the front. That is quite has quite some sharp edges, and then you go to the rear, and you don't find any of that. It's perfectly smooth, apart from the number plate. So definitely not the most consistent design, but it also feels like it's appropriately toned down in the amount of chrome it uses and so on, as there are several parts that could have been chrome and would have been chrome on some other cars that we have seen. But they are not. It just rests on this one strong line, the one strong streak across the sides, and keeps the rest somewhat simple.
Yeah, I generally agree with Rob's assessment there that the front grille is probably quite a bit too big for what it should be. It could get away with having that cut down significantly. I will point out a couple things, is that with regards to sort of the lack of chrome and the general simplicity of the design otherwise, this generally feels like maybe sort of the first or second shot of a company making a car like this. You know, this is a very early model. It doesn't really have a lot of the detailing. It doesn't have a lot of the sort of what you'd expect something would get after several years of being in production and going through several revisions. So this is a very early car, perhaps, in the production of this model. And something else I'd like to point out, you can really see it from the rear, is I think this is the first car we've seen that actually has an appropriate type of paint. A lot of people are really very quick to go to like a really highly glossy, really deep finish on their cars. And certainly for a cheap people's car like this, I don't think they would have necessarily gone to the lengths to give it a really shiny paint job. So this one does have some shine to it, but it's not really like in your face, you know, staring into a paint that seems almost infinitely deep. This feels appropriate for a relatively cheap car.
Something I noticed about it is its basicness kind of goes throughout the whole design. So you can see, based on this shot, very simple instrumentation, like no fancy buttons and that all over the dash. The windows, the front and the back, appear to be two-piece. I'm guessing that's what that big chrome thing is in the middle. But it does have some options, which is interesting, like dual wipers on the top, and then it also has dual rear view mirrors, which is not something you see on every car that we've seen so far.
Was it ever okay to not have indicators visible from the rear?
In some markets it actually was. There was actually a period in time where, certainly in the United States, they used what they called trafficators, which were basically like, they were literally like little fingers that would pop out from the side of your car to basically act like essentially like the hand signals that were mandatory for many, many years. It could also be that this car doesn't actually have amber indicators. It might just have like a double zone bulb in the red brake lights that functions both as brake light and as an indicator light. Something else that I just noticed as Andrew was talking is the door handles are mounted backwards in this car.
Oh yeah, I see that.
And I also just noticed as well that the hinges, the way that they're mounted with one kind of on an angle to the other, I don't necessarily think that would be done, because that would make the doors essentially impossible to open without buckling the hinges. So that's just a very minor, nitpicky little detail though. There are a couple details in here that just get a little bit sloppy, like the drip rail around the door opening is maybe I mean, it's a lot of work putting in fixtures like that. You know, you're taking little bumper bars or whatever you're using, and ringing a section of the body like that. But I think it could have been done just a little bit more tidily, and maybe a different color than the gray plastic. That doesn't really repeat anywhere else in the car.
Yeah, it seems like the biggest drawback for this one would be the grille in the front end. But its simplicity everywhere else kind of makes up for that, in my opinion. I think it's a pretty decent looking car. A lot of decent detail. Not crazy busy like what we've seen in some of the previous vehicles, but definitely simple enough for this class. So the second convertible, or maybe massive sunroofed vehicle that we're seeing today, this one is an interesting one. The first thing that I noticed when looking at it is the red interior. That is very red. So an interesting color combination between this sort of very light and then not very bright blue, sort of a dark light blue that doesn't make any sense, and then a red interior. I also noticed this might be the only car to feature what looks to be rear glass defrosting, which is an interesting touch.
To me, this car has some weird design aspects to it. It is weirdly sportily shaped. It's definitely a car that plays with shapes, because in the profile you don't really see that, but from the front side view, I believe this one instantly had a bit of a sporty, more aggressive look to it and a more flowy look, especially in the rear. Look at that shape in the rear. And that is from the 3/4 rear there. That is quite a bit more like aerodynamic feeling than some of the others that had a much steeper drop off there. And the the convertibility there, the detachable soft top, I love that detail. It's really nicely crafted, I have to say.
Yeah, that's a very nice detail. And actually, I should mention that that convertible soft top is a feature that is available in Automation just as a fixture. So it's very easy to do if you ever want to do that on your own car. But it is placed very nicely, I have to agree. And I like the treatment of the chrome rim around the roof opening, that's a nice touch. Overall, it's a good design. Generally, there are a few miscues here and there. Again, I'm not really 100% convinced on the front grille, to be honest. It's maybe a bit too big, maybe a bit too complicated for a car of this type. And Andrew made a very good point about the red interior, is that it's so red and so sort of bright and contrasting with the rest of the car that it tends to draw your eye straight to the interior and away from a lot of the details that are going on. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a good thing, but it certainly makes it unique, I'd have to say. And I really like this rear 3/4 view, the treatment of how they handle the taillights and the bumpers and the spot for the rear license plate is very nicely considered. I like the rear wheel cover. That's a neat touch, and it's probably something I think you would see certainly in a low-powered car of this era, because you need every last horsepower to fight against the aerodynamic drag of a car like this on the newly built highways of the era. So you're going to do, certainly, at least in this case, the simple little things to make your car just that little bit more aerodynamic, and maybe get an extra kilometer or 2 an hour of top speed to attempt to hold your own on the highway.
Especially with the detachable soft top flapping about and creating loads of drag, that would be vitally important. One thing that I noticed, which is a really nice touch, is the super consistent, because it's just copying things, super consistent use of the bumper design front to back, and I find it very well integrated. If you switch between the straight front and straight back view, you will see that is exactly the same thing there, or almost the same thing, and it's working really well for this design. I do like how the front is framed. It feels naturally spaced in all its aspects. Maybe a little too busy, considering what this car is or wants to be. But it does have that sporty touch to it and almost a little aggressiveness.
Yeah, I think the red interior is a very bold choice, especially in the way that it contrasts between the sort of brown roof and then as well. If you take a look at the dashboard seems to have brown steering wheel and then body colored interior as well. It almost seems like these seats could have been that same brown or maybe a little bit darker, and then it would have made it a little bit more subtle and let the attention go to the rest of the design, which is overall very nice. And again, this one seems like another upscale sort of vehicle with a lot of options for the people's cars. It's like a more expensive rendition.
Yeah, I think it definitely trends more towards the expensive side, and the convertible top I think is the immediate giveaway, because that would actually be a fairly, even though it's actually probably a lot cheaper to make than the metal roof version, they'd probably still find a way to charge you a premium for that, I imagine.
So I do have a question for you, and that is that absolutely horrible looking rear defroster. Why orange? Was that a real thing going on? And why would people put something orange like this, bright orange? Whatever you see, you will see the orange first, because that is the highest contrast color. Why destroy your design with something that is so inconsequential?
I think a lot of times people just put details in without really a huge amount of consideration. It's a discussion that I think we're going to have many times through the course of this judging, is that rear defrosters have always proven to be a very controversial addition within the community in automation.
I can see why. Because if you put something like this in there, then of course it's controversial. But would it be controversial if it was black or gray? I don't think so.
I don't think it would be. Even if it was like a much darker shade of orange, like almost trending towards like a brown almost, I think it would be perhaps a bit more appropriate. And then this bright orange, and I do find from the rear view especially, it really just draws my eye right to that, and it's hard not to look at it. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Andrew.
Honestly, when I first looked at it, I thought it was a flag, and then it just took me a second to realize that it was a defrost. The rust orange is an interesting choice, and I agree that I don't think it really fits with the overall aesthetic of this build. If it was better implemented and more subtle, then that would be better. Especially looking at this view, other than the brown of the roof, that is the first thing you see. So again, it's one of those things where it's like a very bold choice that's taking away your eye from the good parts of the car. Same thing with the seats.
And I think that's a very good point there with the brown of the roof. And if you look at the choice of color for the main choice of color for the body, as you were pointing out, or you were stating, or you wanted to state that it was a slightly more desaturated kind of blue, and that naturally goes well with a more desaturated kind of orange, which is the brown that we see on top. And those two go really well together. And then comes the neon orange.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that it has all this extra stuff like convertible top, rear defrost. 110cc might be a motor upgrade for this vehicle, but it only still has one side mirror. So this car immediately drew my eye with a green that I can only describe as 50s kitchen appliance green. But I think it kind of makes sense for this era, at least the early portion of it, as well as the white color. That two-tone just really kind of pops a little bit. I like the way that sort of coordinates with the interior as well. Continuing with the green, it's green wheels too. They've definitely hard committed to that specific aesthetic.
I think also the overall choice of color is just brilliant. It has this minty green, is so thematic and works super well with the slightly darker white. It's almost a silvery white, but not yeah, it's not too bright, and lets the other colors shine. Like we see in the 3/4 rear, the taillights and indicators, they really come out and shine in this. And I think overall it's just such a tasteful, modest design, which then has a lot of chrome on top of it. It's weird, it's a little bit of a dichotomy there, but I think it works for this car.
Yeah, I think it's generally some very interesting choices overall. The license plate and the lettering in the car kind of implies that this is something you would have seen behind the Iron Curtain. So where this might have been sort of slightly premium in the Western world at the time, this would have been an extremely premium car behind the Iron Curtain with all the chrome and the two-tone paint, and it looks like maybe some interior upgrades. You know, you might actually get proper seats for all the passengers instead of just benches. So I think maybe this it kind of takes it a little bit out of it, having certainly the implication that this is a car from behind the Iron Curtain, and yet it's got all these fancy features and all the fancy paint. It probably, even if this was like the very top of the line car that only the most favored would have access to, I think it might have only have had single tone paint. But the colors, regardless of that, the colors are very appropriate for a car of this era. That's very well considered.
Yeah, something that I keep thinking about when we look at these cars is stuff like dual mirrors, and then this one has dual wipers as well. It's like these extra options kind of add to the luxurious level of the vehicle. This one also has some side vents as well, and that green kind of feeds into them a little bit. Not sure if those would actually be functional in this case. It is a rear engine car, but the hood vents, or I guess boot trunk vents, are quite small as well, so I guess the engine would need to breathe somehow.
One thing that I find very appealing is the kind of eyelid on top of the headlights, and the just perfectly spaced indicators underneath. It feels all very in place and just extremely consistent with how a design like this would be shaped. You could argue that there's a bit of different levels going on, but overall I really like what was done with the front and how it even connects to the rear with the play with color and so on. Yeah, it is really pretty. I think it is a really pretty, weird, easternly looking car.
Yeah, something I noticed pointing out the levels, Rob, is that if you draw a line in the rear from the very bottom of the indicator brake light assembly across to the other one, you'll see that the badging basically is completely bisected by that, which is kind of subconsciously a nice choice to see. However, as you can see here in the action shot at the front, it doesn't quite do the same thing with the front indicators. So there is a bit of a multi-level thing going on, and I don't know if you could actually really fix that without it being really awkward looking, or what you maybe have to do is have the front badge basically bisect the indicators and the headlights a little bit more equally. Also, I'm really not sure, looking at this now, about the little tiny little vents right at underneath the bumpers. They don't really seem to fit very well in terms of shape, and it's not something that's repeated anywhere else in the car.
Looking at that previous picture that you had up, the sort of in action shot, I guess, I just noticed that this is the happiest looking car ever, with the like little dimples on his cheeks and everything. I guess it's meant to brighten up the day of whoever's driving it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't really even notice, but now that you pointed out, I'm having a hard time not seeing the smiley little face with its dimpled cheeks.
Yeah, it's subtle, but with the shadows in this particular image, you can really see the little smiley face grill in there. This one is unique, to say the least. It sort of screams like military concept vehicle to me. That was the first thing I thought of when I looked at it. Is like, hold on, is this from like a leftover from World War II? Very interesting design. I like the wheel covers as an example. Covering up those wheels kind of adds to the flow of the car. The vents on the back windows are very modern. I think that sort of takes away from the overall look of it. And they also don't really lead anywhere, at least from what we can see in these pictures. It is a rear engine car, but it's a strange choice, I think, to have those in.
I think what we are looking at here is a superhero movie or action hero movie car that was designed specially for that purpose, but probably with the perspective of someone who has seen such movies before and such car designs too. There are a lot of modern elements in here, like the various scoop-shaped, or look at the rear window in this view, for instance, or the on the side, the rear window rather, and that scoop kind of thing that we have on there, this seems so much more modern than what you would have seen there. In general, the shapes are just a little bit comic book to me, and I can't shake that feeling. This definitely doesn't fit with the theme at all in my eyes. I like the Cyclops approach to this, which, well, you can't really call it a Cyclops if it has 3 eyes, can you? Or if they're equal size at least. But overall, it's such a weird build. What do you think, Chris?
It's definitely very weird, and it's everywhere you look. There's just another weird thing that makes you just think, what is going on here? From the front, I actually kind of like the 3 lights with the 2 headlights and the central driving light. As weird as it is, it actually somehow kind of works here. This car, Andrew touched on it seeming a little bit like a concept car. My thought initially was that this feels like a prototype. Somebody, maybe in a country that's not super democratic, there's a lot of planning that goes on in their economy. Somebody in their government went to another country and saw all these little sort of rounded cars scurrying around the road, and they thought, well, we need to do something like that for our country. We need to have a vehicle like this that gets our people on the road. So they get their automotive industry to design something like this, and this is kind of what they come up with as a first shot. It's, I guess, in a way, I mean, I've referred to cars like this before, but it kind of feels like someone described a people's car to another person over the phone, and this is what they came up with. So it's a little bit weird in places. I can't really fault the detailing, though. I mean, everywhere you look, the details are just abound. From the hinges to certainly how in the front, the way that the license plate is handled, and sort of the metal stamping that goes on there, to a really highly unusual single wiper actuated from up above. That's kind of neat. Although some of the details I think are a bit of a miss, like the treatment above on the front hood or luggage compartment is maybe a little bit overdone and a little bit too much, perhaps. And the bumpers, I think, if you could even call these bumpers, I don't think they'd even do this in the period for a car like this. They'd probably have proper bumpers, or at very least a split bumper, where it's 2 pieces that might have an open central section. So a lot of weirdness for sure.
Yeah, I noticed the bumpers as well, just being very, very small, kind of useless, and that sort of drives that concept vibe. It's just like, this is not a car that actually drives. I like what you said, Rob, about comic book. I think that makes a lot of sense. That sort of clicked in my head a little bit when you were talking about that. There are a couple other strange choices, like there seems to be some kind of indicator or maybe reflective piece on the door jamb there, on the pillar. The doors are suicide doors, again a unique option. On the front, there are some very small vents, venting nothing. I guess they vent the luggage compartment. And the seats are trimmed with red, which is very unique as well. I really like that wiper. Now that you pointed it out, it's asymmetrical. It only clears the driver's side, which is cool. I think that's something that we could definitely see in some of the other vehicles, is like a nice little cheap detail. But this car, it's hard to rate where it would be on any kind of like expensive or cheap scale, because it's just so out of this world different that I don't know, it's very unique and concepty.
Also, just the size of the lights would be, those would probably be quite expensive. Just that feature alone. And the wheel covers are probably also hinting at something a little bit more sporty even. But the rest of the car doesn't quite have that look, apart from it being a little meanie car from the from the feel I'm getting. It could be. Oh, I think I know now. Going even more into the comic book aspects, this would be the car driven by the villain in the comic book.
Again, this car is such a dark color that really any kind of color at all draws your eye towards it. Whether it's the lights and the license plate at the front, or the indicator on the side, or the interior trim. You have to be very careful with a car of this color to not draw your eye to areas that you don't want people to look at necessarily, and draw your eyes to the areas that you think you really want them to look at.
So no doubt this is a very creative build, and a detailed one, and like with attention to detail as well. It's just super weird, and to me, it doesn't really fit the bill.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it might fit the bill as a people's car, but I think it fits it in a way that the others don't really do. Sticking with the theory crafting of this feels like somebody who has been told, design a people's car. This is what we want it to look like. And then they come up with this. And it's almost ironic in a way, because it kind of feels like they went to great lengths and spent huge amounts of money developing this thing, and came up with a bit of a camel, to say the least.
I think we can approach this from a different angle and think about it almost as like a 50s cyberpunk car. It's like their concept cars of the time, but then brought into real life almost. This almost feels like it could be part of some kind of alternate reality show type thing. So this car, I think, gets the award for the most basic people's car that we've seen today, with the sort of asterisk in the sense that it also seems to be a deluxe version of said basic car. Very simple design, nice small car, just a small coupe, not overly exaggerated in any way. It looks very functional, and I think that those things kind of combine together to hit that people's car category well. In some ways, I think that the seats might be a little bit too modern for the build. They seem to be a little bit out of place to me. But overall, other than that, it kind of comes together to be that basic car with just black steel wheels and all that stuff. It does have the dual mirrors and things as a bit of an option, though.
That is pretty much what mirrors my thoughts there as well, and it does have the look of a just extremely practical vehicle. From front to back, it's quite consistent in what it does, and there is not that much going on, but it doesn't have to, and it tells you straight away that, yeah, this is what I do. There's nothing more to see here. Please. Enjoy the ride, and I do like the design overall. It is a good-looking, very basic car, of course, with options, as you pointed out, Andrew. But yeah, I'm quite enjoying the build.
So if I may pose a question to both of you gentlemen, what year do you think this car is, just looking at it?
I was gonna say 70s, early 70s, maybe late 60s.
To me, it has aspects of the late 50s, but there are definitely elements in there that are more towards 70s, indeed, yes. So it's maybe a little off-era, you would point out, Chris?
Yeah, that is my single biggest criticism with this design, is that, especially the body shape, it's unmistakably what you'd see at the earliest, sort of in the late 1960s, and probably more towards the early 1970s. It's just far too modern for the design brief, which of course cuts off at 1960. So, I mean, you might start to see the emergence of a sort of like the hatchback body style. Like the Mini, of course, came about in 1959, so a body like that would have been more appropriate. But this is just too far forward in the future, I think, for the design brief, and that unfortunately really takes me out of it. Unfortunately.
What would have been design elements that could have been put on there that would have made you change your mind, even though it had the same body shape? Or a similar body shape, because you could argue that you could have done some different morphings and so on.
I don't know if you could actually take this body far enough back to make it look appropriate for the design brief. It's just so unmistakably from the era it's from, which is, like I said, right around, we could call it sort of an average of about 1970-ish, that I don't think you could take it back far enough with any features on it to make it look appropriate for the design brief. And don't get me wrong, if this was a 1970s people's car, I think it would be very appropriate and very well done for that, generally. I mean, there's a couple misses here and there. It's just...
Yeah, in that way, it's a bit of a hybrid between different generations. Like, it has chrome, but then it also has the like very basic plasticky trim around the windows and then on the doors, and then just black steel wheels as well. I don't know. This is a hard one. It's hard to place it, I think.
I definitely think the interior of what we see of the dashboard looks way more era appropriate than the rest of the car, it's quite barren. But yes, it is an odd one, and I agree. Now that you're pointing it out, I can see it. I definitely see that it's struggling to fit in the era.
Yeah, and there's even more things too. Like it's got a rear wiper on it, which is, I mean, that is a super premium feature even in like the 1970s and 80s, never mind in... I honestly don't know if there were any cars that had rear wipers back in the 50s and 60s. It's just something that would have been utterly foreign at the time. Especially when you've only got one front wiper. That seems like a really odd choice. The other weird thing too, looking at it here in the parking shot, it's got a really big antenna.
Oh wow, yeah. Or someone is headed to fencing classes or something and just awkwardly has stuck it out there.
So this car has the distinction of being what appears to be the largest vehicle that we have looked at today by a significant margin, a full 6-seater with what looks to be a decent-sized trunk as well. So a lot of space for the luggage and the entire family. We got blue on beige with a white dashboard, and overall it's a very simple design. But I think it's fairly elegant, and it does what it needs to do.
In terms of the focus group that we have here, family in that era, without the added suffix of premium, I think this one is one of the few that strikes that category perfectly, as in not premium. As we do see more modest amounts of chrome and in general fixtures that would be extremely expensive, and it does so really well. It is a perfectly boring car that is extremely well executed in its boringness and just utility in general for the family.
Yeah, I agree. As I pointed out in my comments on this, is that all of the cars we'd seen prior to this one are basically, what is the minimum viable amount of car to have 4 occupants inside, or 5 occupants, or whatever it may be, depending on how big or how small the car is. This car feels more like the design brief was build the most amount of car for the least amount of money, or for a set price point. And they were able to build something that's really quite large. And while it might not necessarily be what people think is as a people's car, quote unquote, being, you know, a small city runabout type of thing, this is exactly the kind of car that you'd build if you were, as kind of the license plate implies, perhaps behind the Iron Curtain, as is saying, this is the car for your entire family to load up and go on a holiday for a week or two to the planned resort town, and this is how you get there.
Also, one would add that it would probably, while it's made for a family of a maximum of 6, they would probably squeeze in 8 at least. And of course, plus animals. Because this thing is quite large compared to the other cars. And if you have ridden any of the in any of the other cars that we've seen previously, which crammed in 5, this seems like a whole cruise ship.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's many sizes larger than any of the other cars that we've seen here. It does have some really nice details. Like I really quite like the spine that runs down the center of the car. It basically starts at the badging on the front, runs down the hood, over the split windshield, over the roof even, and then as we head towards the back, over the rear window and right down to the handle to open the rear luggage compartment. That's a really neat detail. It's actually very well done, I think.
Yeah, this car being the largest of what we've seen today almost makes it seem like it could be a bus compared to the other vehicles. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. A lot of the cars that we've seen have been focused on just smallness, and then they're also sort of based on the cars that we think of when we think of people's cars, which were also mentioned in the original document for this, stuff like Beetles, stuff like Minis and Trabants and things like that. Just very small cars that could be at least theoretically bought by the everyday person. Yeah, the grille is an interesting choice. When I was looking at it originally, I was thinking it was a little bit out of place. Just the thickness of the chrome around it. I know that fixture in particular is one that starts off thick, so when you make it bigger, it just kind of expands out even more. I'm not sure. I wondered what your guys' opinion was on that grille at the front in particular.
I think it's, now that you pointed out, it doesn't really fit. First of all, I don't think it really fits. None of the sizes and proportions really shape, like the grille really fit with the rest of what's going on there. It's a little bit too wide at the bottom to sort of be a continuation of the lines coming off the hood, and the overall size of the other end of the grille doesn't really seem to fit anywhere else. And the really thick rim it looks odd, I think, in this context.
I certainly agree with that, and I would like to point out that it's likely the variable thickness of the rim around the grille that is the most upsetting in this. And also it seems to be the most expensive part on the whole car. That's a lot of metal you have there.
And a lot of very expensive chrome plating too, because it should be pointed out that at the time, chrome plating was really quite expensive to do, and the more chrome you had on your car, it was kind of a status thing, especially even in the United States, with the economy roaring as it was in the 1950s. The chrome plating was still not cheap to do, and the more of it you had on your car, the richer you were, and I guess by extension, that the better person you were, or at least that's what they wanted you to think.
As we were looking at the front of it, I pointed this out in a previous vehicle as well, but this car just looks distraught. Like with the grille and the headlights being eyes, it just looks like it's very upset, which I think the movie Cars, the Pixar movie, may have scarred me permanently, because now I just see faces in every single front end. But I don't know. And it's another one with a very distinctive sort of mouth, and then the thickness around the grille would be its lips, I guess.
It's definitely not the happiest car in the world, that's for sure. I'm certainly not anywhere near the happiest car in our field of 10 finalists. Okay, that is it for our 10 finalists.
Yeah, thank you again, guys. Appreciate your time.
Cheers. And that concludes this category. A big thanks to our guest for joining us, and thank you for watching. Check out the links below and subscribe to the channel to not miss any of the competition videos.